Michael Shellenberger, thank you for joining us. Now, you have done a lot of work that's led global conversations around what you've dubbed the censorship industrial complex. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and why this work is important to you?
Well, sure. I mean, my interest in censorship really began when I was one of the Twitter files authors. We were given access to internal emails and messages within Twitter. And what we discovered was at first the kind of censorship that you would expect, very politically correct, very sort of radical left censorship. But then we started to discover something very strange, which is we started to see requests from the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, other sort of security and intelligence agencies asking for people to be censored. We found that very chilling and very strange. And that really was the beginning of starting to understand that there was a vast apparatus of government agencies around the world, not just in the United States, think tanks, some of them associated with universities, and other groups that were putting pressure on social media platforms to engage in outright censorship of people for just having different views, whether on COVID vaccines or on climate change or on various racial matters, sensitive issues that should be publicly debated, that our Constitution protects as free speech, really clear violations of the First Amendment. And we was shocking to see that the government was funding these organizations to the tune of tens of millions and maybe hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's why we labeled it the censorship industrial complex, because it's quite big, quite powerful, and really until recently was hidden from the public.
Yeah, that was an amazing body of work, the Twitter files, and that jumped out at me as well because I expected there to be a lot of progressive censorship, but you're right. What really came out of that was intelligence agencies communicating, saying what can and cannot be allowed. For us here in Australia, I think the problem's intensified a bit because we're not American and we're supposed to have a free and independent society. So when you've got these giant American tech giants that are influencing our debates, that makes it somewhat worse, in my opinion. Have you seen the tentacles spread globally in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the people of Australia should be very alarmed by this. This is an infringement on your sovereignty. It's potentially election interference by Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO and owner of Facebook, as well as of Meta and of Meta, Facebook, Threads, and Instagram. I mean, I was shocked by your reporting, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I thought I had seen quite a bit already, but what we saw there is really Zuckerberg and Facebook putting their finger on the scale and really censoring opponents of this major referendum you have down there, a very sensitive racial referendum with a lot of different views, and really funding partisans in that fight to censor their opponents. I mean, it's really outrageous. It's really straight out of George Orwell, if you ask me, that kind of power. And in answer to your question, yeah, we have. I mean, you may know that there's this longstanding Five Eyes Nations agreement that has really involved spying by the US, the Great Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, surveillance on their citizens, much of which we know was going on illegally, exposed by Edward Snowden about 10 years ago. And, you know, now we see that actually it went from not just spying, but also into censorship. And I'll tell you what, there's a lot here that's very disturbing. But, you know, one of the things that's disturbing about this is that we have seen intelligence agencies, including the CIA, historically use race to divide people and destabilize governments and destabilize countries. And the involvement of intelligence agencies, security agencies, Facebook, whose senior executives all hail from the CIA. Their senior executives on censorship almost all hail from the CIA and other intelligence agencies. So this is a very creepy and disturbing turn. I think that what we need is for the people around the world we need to find each other, those of us that believe in free speech, that believe in privacy. This is not a left-right issue. This is sometimes being split up that way. But, you know, traditionally, these concerns have united us as free peoples. And I think that it's an important time for Americans and Australians and Britons that care about privacy and that care about free speech to find each other and to form a common alliance against what is frankly a totalitarian marriage of big tech and big government.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And when you're looking into how Facebook has set up this ecosystem, I think the apparatus of fact checking, it doesn't appear to be following its own rules. And one thing that Mark Zuckerberg has testified to governments all around the world, his representatives here in Australia testified in the Australian Senate quite recently in 2021, that it's independent, the fact checking process. Now, we have obtained a direct commercial contract that shows that that's not entirely true, the way that it's been painted. Individual fact checks warrant payments, which makes there an incentive for organisations to do more fact checks, and the financial relationship is directly with an Irish subsidiary, which is obviously for tax reasons. But what do you make of that, the claim that it is this independent fact checking, it's experts who are doing it, except the relationship is directly financial?
Well, that's right. It was a very important discovery that you made to find that the Facebook was paying people by the fact check. I mean, that's an incentive to engage in censorship. I think we need to remember that this is fact checking in quotation marks. This is fact checking in service of censorship. It's absolutely biased. It has a particular political point of view. It tends to be anti-populist. It tends to be more left-wing than right-wing. And I think what we've seen is that the International Fact-Checking Network, which was supposedly independent, created by something called the Poynter Institute, it was supposed to be independent. It's absolutely not. It has a partisan political agenda in the United States. Clearly now we see it has a partisan political agenda in Australia. And I think we're seeing a very scary manipulation because, I mean, even you think about George Orwell, he was writing at a time before the internet, and governments were, the censorship back then was obviously terrifying. But when you consider that the internet gives governments and corporations that are often beholden to those governments these powers to censor citizens around the world, we start to see a completely grotesque abuse of power by these big tech companies. They have got to be reined in. As long as they have a lot of business with governments, they're always going to be subject to governments demanding that they censor more. And sometimes it's petty, it's politicians that don't want to be criticized, demanding that their opponents be censored. But we've also seen large-scale censorship, like Facebook did not want to engage in all the censorship that the Biden administration was proposing during COVID, because they knew actually the evidence showed that the more censorship you do of discussions around vaccines, it actually makes people more suspicious, and rightly so. And Facebook actually pushed back against it, but then a senior Facebook executive named Nick Clegg, who's a former British politician, he said, well, we actually need to do the censorship because we need the support of the White House to help them with so-called data flows, meaning getting data from the European Union sent back to the United States, which is part of a $1.2 billion annual business for Facebook in Europe. Google's business is almost 10 times that. So what you see is that this exercise of these coercion, and then the flip side, the incentives for censorship, governments and politicians, including the President of the United States, are abusing those powers. There needs to be a serious investigation by all English language countries, in my opinion, and probably by foreign language countries too. But certainly we could start with those of us in the English-speaking world to get to the bottom of what our politicians have been doing, because clearly we've uncovered, I think, what perhaps is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this censorship industrial complex.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to the point where who is defining what misinformation is? And have we just lost the ability to debate?
Well, that's right. I mean, there's really sort of two questions there. I mean, what started to happen is that with growing intolerance of other people's views, you see particular political activists labeling disagreements misinformation. Opinions about whether that's a good piece of legislation, where fair-minded people can have a different point of view, people will label that misinformation. So it's a real abuse of that term in particular. But I also think that, look, free speech, whether in the United States or in Australia, or whether it's what's in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, it says that we're not actually going to only protect free speech for things that we agree with or with things that we consider to be accurate. Free speech is everybody's right. There's only a very small number of cases where governments in free societies restrict what people are able to say. It's fraud, incitement to violence, child exploitation. Those are very limited things, but really much more broadly. And by the way, the incitement to violence has to be immediate. It can't be vague, prejudicial, or racist statements. Those are all things that society must allow. In fact, we have an instrumental reason for that. We think it's better for people to overcome their prejudices and hatred by being able to talk about them. If there's people have bad ideas, we think it's better to talk about those ideas rather than to censor and repress them for it. But we also think that it's a fundamental human right to be able to share your views and to have access to information, whether it's accurate or inaccurate. This is what it means to live in a free society. This debate was had, I should point out, really 300 years ago in Europe. We decided that the public really wanted free speech. We did not want the government deciding what was true or false, because obviously politicians have a big incentive to lie and to censor their political opponents. And so I do think that we need to remind people that these freedoms that we've taken for granted are really under threat. And those include the right to disagree, to be disagreeable, and even to offend people. That's absolutely a protected right, and one that we should demand be protected.
Yeah, and another disturbing part of the investigation that we've done is a lot of this censorship appears to be tied to universities. And as you say, this was traditionally an area, academia, which would foster debate, which was very proud of having the debate. I mean, that's a very scientific part of methodology and how you actually reach these new conclusions. We're seeing these fact-checking operations in taxpayer-funded universities. They have a very, very strong progressive bend. What's happened to our universities? And can the average person do anything to fight back against this?
Well, I think it's very sad and frankly infuriating that the universities, which were created for open dialogue and for disagreement, that's how progress is made. That's how we do science. That's how we learn things. I mean, imagine students, they're too afraid to speak out in class because of the general culture of intolerance that's settled in. We all saw cancel culture, this kind of intolerance and even sort of hatred of disfavored views. We saw that rise over the last 10 years. And I think that the censorship industrial complex is feeding on that intolerance. So it does make sense, sadly, that the universities and many of the think tanks associated with them would be involved in these censorship activities, including these fake fact checks, which are really truly aimed at censoring opinions that people don't like. So yeah, I think there is a lot that needs to be done. First, I think that citizens should demand that their governments defund the censorship police. That includes defunding these university programs that have words in them like misinformation, disinformation, fact-checking. All of those are fronts for censorship, and they should be defunded. If there's good work they've done, then they should do it in the topic areas of their choice, whether it's the environment or history or whatever it may be. But anybody that sets themselves up and says, I'm a truth expert, or I'm an expert in misinformation, or I'm an expert in disinformation, first of all, that person is a liar, because they're saying that they are an expert in everything, and they're claiming godlike powers to decide what's true. I think we have to be more humble than that. We have to accept some humility that we're all wrong sometimes. We all misspeak. We're better off being able to speak freely and openly. That issue has been decided hundreds of years ago. We have constitutions that protect that. So I do think citizens need to demand from their lawmakers that they defund the censorship police. That's got to be at the top of our list. And I think this kind of dialogue that we're having, I think that we're building a new free speech alliance around the world, and coming out with a strong statement from people around the world, including people who are being persecuted. I think we need to find each other. I think we do need a new citizens movement, because sadly, many of the groups that had been previously advocates of free speech and of civil liberties have taken the wrong path and are themselves demanding censorship of people that they disagree with.
Yeah, and I would have thought that we would have learnt our lesson from COVID, because there were a lot of information came out during the pandemic that ended up not being true. I don't know if you remember Fauci talking about masks and how you don't need them, and then he later came out and said, well, I was only saying that so we didn't run out of masks. And that's, an intentional act to mislead to get a functional policy change, which I don't think that makes it okay. But you can really see through the pandemic, even if it's the origins of the virus, how effective border lockdowns are, the mechanisms by which you keep the populace safe. The science shifted quite rapidly, but people were getting fact-checked on the very preliminary assumptions that we were making based on observational science as opposed to very long-standing research. Since all of that, since we've known that we've been wrong, we've known the governments have made the wrong decisions, we still seem to have emboldened this industry, and I can't seem to figure out why we are doubling down.
Well, that's right. There's actually 2 instances where Anthony Fauci, who oversaw America's COVID response, spread disinformation, defined as knowingly false information. The first time he said, don't use masks, even though he said that you don't need them, even though he knew differently. And the second time he said there's really no evidence that that COVID could have leaked from a lab. And he knew that was false because his top scientists told him that. And so we saw what we're seeing is the people who spread mis and disinformation around COVID are the ones advocating censorship. I would also point out that Facebook censored what itself called often true information about vaccine side effects. This is absolutely appalling, unethical behavior. It's probably illegal behavior as well. This is something that people have fought for decades so that pharmaceutical companies have to name the side effects of their drugs in their television ads. And here Facebook was censoring people describing what had happened to their own children. As a parent, I think most parents would like to know what other parents are experiencing if their kids are coming down with vaccine side effects. The idea that that should be censored by the government is absolutely anathema to democratic values that have existed in Western societies for hundreds of years. It's absolutely immoral. What they're doing is they're manipulating people's fears and their emotions to trick them into supporting censorship. So they're constantly creating crises, whether on COVID or climate change or the Ukraine war, and suggesting that somehow, because we're in some sort of crisis, that we should give up our free speech rights. And that's absolutely wrong. Particularly in a crisis, you need to have free speech. How would you know how to deal with a problem like COVID if you can't have debate about it? This is all predicates, excuses to crack down, to censor your fellow people. I think the motivations behind it are really poor as well. And the motivations behind it are intolerance of other people's views. I think even a kind of hatred of your fellow citizens, a kind of elitism, this view that, oh, I never get anything wrong. I mean, one of the things that we discovered in our own research is there's something called the third person effect. And it's a kind of narcissism, which is this idea that if you're out there policing mis and disinformation and demanding it be censored, you're a kind of person who thinks that you're never guilty of being wrong. That's very problematic behavior. We have a lot in Western philosophy, in various religions that teach us to be more humble than that, to recognize that we might be wrong, that we might be hypocritical. And so this arrogance and this elitism that says, oh, I'm the one that's going to go out there and decide what people should be allowed to hear and say, it's offensive, and people should feel angry about it, in my view.
Yeah, as a journalist and editor, during the pandemic, I also got a whiff of this, the lesser evil argument. And an example I'll give you is we had a whole bunch of young women, a couple of dozen, not hundreds, but a couple of dozen of young women that died after taking AstraZeneca. And in the newsroom, we're trying to figure out how do we report that, knowing that there were these restrictions. And some of the policies were so overbearing that it was if you give your audience the belief or the opinion that vaccines don't work or could be dangerous, then you could fall foul of community guidelines. And so that's something that all newsrooms have to reconcile, because you can't lose a distribution point such as Facebook. It's important into a lot of news organisations' business models, and therefore you've got a situation where you can't report the reality, the truth, because you don't, academics or pharmaceutical companies or even governments want a particular outcome. They don't want the vaccine rate to drop below a certain threshold. So they're okay with this lesser evil. The lesser evil being you just ignore a legitimate news story.
That's very scary. That's very terrifying. That's straight out of George Orwell. This idea that you should self-censor. I mean, that really shows that the censors have won already when journalists are refusing to report accurate information because they're afraid of being criticized about what people might do with that information. That's a very chilling effect, I think, and it's a very bad for journalism. We've really come a long way from, I mean, we think we've made so much progress compared to the mid 1700s or the early 1800s. But that sort of thing was absolutely viewed as a human right, that you had a right to say what you believed and that you had a right to hear other people's opinion. The idea that here we are 250 years later, after the Declaration of independence from the United States and the Constitution of the United States, but really constitutions of governments around the world, of democratic governments, now we have people saying, oh, I don't know if I should report the truth or if I'll get in trouble for it. That's a sign that your civilization and democracy is in trouble. So I do think this should be, I hope it's a wake-up call. I think it has been a wake-up call for people that are paying attention. I think the other thing that's happened is just that it's been a media blackout. It's really been a small number of media organizations, including Sky News or our organization, Public, which is a Substack publication, or Matt Taibbi and Barry Weiss, who have reported on this. But for the most part, the media has played the opposite role, demanding censorship of their competitors, including independent media, sometimes for financial advantages and just because of their generalized intolerance. So I do hope this is a wake-up call. I do think what's so special about the West and about Western civilization is our appreciation of free speech. We don't get everything right in the United States, but free speech is really one of the most special parts of our country, and I think it's a special part of Australia and all the English-speaking world, and we should fight to defend it because I do think we're at risk of losing it.
Well said. Michael Shellenberger, thank you so much for joining me.